Elara's Corner. Cal Merritt first noticed the old woman the way he noticed most things in town, not for what they were, but for where they sat against the usual outline of the day. He worked a string of jobs that belonged to places more than to people. In the mornings, he unlocked the public works shed and checked on the pumps for the irrigation lines that kept the parks from going bald. He patched potholes along the bypass, hands black with the sticky grit that stayed under his nails through every wash. He cut grass along the fence of the cemetery whenever the town sent him a note with a small budget attached. He kept glass cleaner and paper towels in the cab, and a dented thermos, the same green as a pine shed roof. His life was a slow collection of noises and temperatures. The saw whine of a weed trimmer, the wet slap of a hose against gravel, the way cold steel tools at dawn held the chill long after the sun found the roofs. He saw her from the cab window on his way back from the dump one evening as dusk smeared the sky with the last brush of light. She moved along the sidewalk with a small bouquet of long-stemmed wildflowers clutched low, a handful of yellow and white heads still dusty from the field. His first thought, practical and uncharitable, was that the stems would leave a trail of seed that the maintenance crew would have to pluck from the edges of the cemetery paths later. The second thought was that he had never seen her in town before. In Blackwood, the familiar faces wore down to soft shapes like stones in a creek. Even names that drifted in from elsewhere tended to stack up in certain corners of his mind. He kept a quiet map of who bought coffee at the filling station before sunrise, whose mailbox hinged crooked, who still backed into a parking spot at the grocery store out of habit. The old woman did not exist on that map, and the lack of a dot for her made a kind of pressure. He turned onto Mill Road, and the low stone wall of the cemetery slid into view on his right, each block mortared with a rough hand. The truck rattled over a seam in the asphalt, and the thermos clunked against the door. He watched her through the rear-view mirror as she reached the iron gate and angled through, a slight tilt of shoulder that showed she knew the way the latch stuck. She did not glance toward the newer section near the road where smooth markers stood squared and light as breadboards. She kept walking, her steps patient, flowers balanced against the sway of her coat. Cal should have looked away, watched the potholes that gathered at the curb like open mouths, but something in the pace of her, the steady metronome of it, snagged him. At the shed, he backed the truck into its spot and killed the engine. The frogs in the retention pond at the edge of the lot made a noise like wet rubber rubbing against itself. The air smelled of oil and cut grass and the damp mineral of the pond. He took the clipboard from the hook by the door and scribbled the mileage and fuel, and he sat there longer than he meant to, the engine tick-ticking as it cooled. The light over the workbench hummed, a thin saw of a sound, and his ears adjusted around it the way they always did. When he finally moved, he moved in the unthinking chain of habit, rinse the shovel blades, coil the hoses, hang the bright safety vest by the nail. His hands did these small acts the way a body breathes in sleep. Driving home along the same road, he looked for the old woman by reflex. He did not find her. The cemetery wall slid by empty. A single moth battered itself against the light over the gate, beating a slow, soft panic. He told himself not to make a story of it. People brought flowers to the dead. It was what they did. He did this same loop before, and it had never bothered him. He made the turn onto Pine Street and felt something shift along his scalp, a little ripple like sweat cooling, as if a weather front had moved through the cab. At his apartment, a narrow upstairs space above what used to be a feed store and was now a used furniture shop, he opened the refrigerator. The bulb inside was slow to wake, coming up through a dim yellow to something more steady. The hum from the compressor had a note that flickered now and then, a faint change in pitch he had learned to ignore. He carried the thermos to the sink, emptied the rattle of old coffee grounds that slid out in a black river, and rinsed. The water came thin and metallic, smelling faintly like takeout foil. He stood in the small square of light over the sink and listened to the building settle, the two radiators ticking, the upstairs neighbor dropping what sounded like marbles or ball bearings, one by one onto the floor. Though he knew it was only a cat rolling something. He slept badly. The bed springs spoke whenever he turned. At some point near dawn, he half-dreamed a hollow thud from far below, as if someone gently closed a thick door. The sound did not belong to the building. It was an outside sound, like the heavy lid of a chest in a storage room. When he woke to the freight of the day, pressing his chest light, coming in grey through the blinds, he could remember only that door shutting and the smell of dirt the way it smells after rain, when it is still too cold for anything to grow. The next days stacked themselves neatly for a while. He did his routes. He changed a broken sprinkler head at the baseball field, his knees wet from kneeling in the light mud. He picked up branches after a wind, throwing them into the bed of the truck, hearing the thick whip of them against the metal sides. He drove the riding mower along the long strip of grass by the water treatment station, a place where green always seemed too green, fed by things that were not meant to be food. He passed the cemetery many times without thought, because habit makes the mind skip the familiar things and chew instead on burrs of worry that can be solved. The mower belt that frayed, the invoice that needed a signature, the message blinking on the answering machine in the shed with a steady, patient strobe. Then, one evening again near the soft edge of dusk, he saw her. The bouquet was different this time, all white and small-headed, something delicate that clung to wet ditches in spring. The same careful pace carried her, and the same lack of hurry. Cal's fingers tightened on the wheel without meaning to. He felt a flush of annoyance at himself for the way his chest responded, chest answering the sight the way a dog lifts its ears to a whistle. He slowed at the corner to let a pickup swing through, and when he turned his head, he found her eyes by accident. They were not strange. That was the first surprise. They did not look at him with any knowledge. The second surprise was that they looked almost relieved, as if every step toward the gate cut away a little of something heavy she had carried through town. The next morning, the town clerk left a typed note for Cal in the shed, with a coffee stain in the corner. The Cemetery Advisory Committee, newly active because a donor threatened to fund a fence, wanted the older section trimmed and the low branches cut back along the far corner. There had been complaints about the briars creeping in and scratching pant legs. He could not help the smile that crept over his face at the word committee. He could name the voices behind it without their names on the paper. Stooped men with hands in their pockets and a distance in their eyes, the kind of people who talked about duty like it was a thing you held in your mouth until it dissolved. He pulled the trailer with the mower into the service entrance of the cemetery, the iron gate rattling a little more than usual. He had to get down and work the latch. It stuck cold and iron-smelling under his hands. Inside, he followed the gravel lane past the newer plots, the small flags, the flat vases that clanked in a light wind. He drove slowly, a kind of apology in his pace, though he did not know to whom he apologized. Beyond the small brick building, where the sexton used to keep records back when there was a full-time sexton, and not just a shared file in the clerkette's office, the ground dipped. The mower bounced through ruts left by a maintenance truck last autumn, and the shocks squeaked. The oldest corner sat under a stand of oaks, whose bark flaked off in long plates. The headstones there were thin and leaned like teeth. He cut the engine and listened to the settling clicks of the machine. It felt like stepping into an emptied room. Distantly, the sawmill by the river sent a soft clatter through the air, almost a cough. He walked the area with a trimmer at his side, tapping each stone with his hand where the base had broken free from the cement plinth, testing what would take weight and what would not. He pushed weeds out of the way with the toe of his boot, and found ground that felt not quite right. It gave under his weight more softly than it should have, the way a worn step on a porch will have more sway than its brothers. He told himself it was gopher work or tree roots, mapping their slow, patient heave in the dark. He cut brush along the old fence line until his shoulders had that tight band of ache across them that made sleep honest. He did not hear footsteps behind him, though more than once he turned and found himself expecting to find someone standing there with a problem to lay down. At the farthest corner, half swallowed by lichen, he found a marker set low, barely more than a garden stone. The name on it, cleaned lightly with the rag he kept in his pocket, surfaced like a fish underwater. Elara Thorne. The letters were shallow, a hand long dead carving language into stone. He said the name in his head just to fix it, the way he learned roads by naming each one under his breath as he drove. He straightened and saw where the grass was pressed just beyond the marker, a kind of shallow crease long as a body and tight as a made bed. He told himself it meant someone had knelt there recently, had placed flowers, had tended. This comforted him in a small, shy way. People who tended the dead put a hedge around everybody in town. The hedge was thin, but it held something back. He liked to believe that. Still, when he turned to leave, he was careful with his steps, as if stepping around a thing asleep. That night, he could not settle. The refrigerator hummed steady as always, the pitch shifting only once when the compressor kicked on. He washed a coffee mug by hand because the dishwasher in the shared basement had a habit of clacking its way through cycles, and he did not want to listen to it. He folded a rag over the back of the chair and smoothed it with his palm. He stood there, not moving the way he had found himself doing in the shed, sometimes caught in that little pause before you decide to do something, and the pause stretches long enough that you can hear it like a sound in a room. Sleep came late and ran thin. He dreamed of the far corner under the oaks, and he dreamed of the old stone that breathed. He woke sweating, the sheets peeled sideways. On the street, a delivery truck downshifted, and the sound clung to his nerves long after the truck was gone. He got up, drank water from the tap that tasted faintly like old coins, and sat at the kitchen table. The building had a small sway he had never noticed, a crane's slow patience, the kind of movement that would not bother you unless you paid it attention. He wondered if it always did that through the night, and he had simply never been awake for it. In the shed the next day, the answering machine blinked like an obedient heartbeat. He pressed the button and listened to the messages. Most were the usual. A coach wanted the chalk lines repainted at the field. Someone's compost had blown across the path at the arboretum. At the end of the list came a voice he did not know, slow and careful and old. It did not ask for work. It said his name as if tasting it. Then it said the word gate. Then the message ended, cut off, or maybe that was all it had intended to be. He pressed the button again. The machine played the clicks of silence before the voice, the long flat lung of nothing that contains 1,000 kinds of breath. When the word gate came, he felt his scalp tighten the way it had when he first saw the old woman. You can live a long time on these small jolts. He went to the cemetery in the late afternoon under the errand of checking the latch. The iron was cold, though the sun was strong. The catch did seem worse than a week ago. He took pliers from the truck and bent it back into trueness, and he greased the hinge with a smear of the brown paste kept for that. While he worked, the sound of a receipt printer chirped from somewhere. He looked up, frowning. It was that very particular noise, a little birdie shriek of friction as the paper spools out. He listened hard. The cemetery had no such machine. The sound came again, softer, fading, then gone. Far across town, in the clerk's office, someone must have run a transaction, and the air must have carried a sliver of it. That was the story he wrote for it. He watched the gate swing smooth and quiet and felt better for having done a tangible piece of work. His hands carried a slight copper smell from the grease. He capped the tube and put it back in the truck with a faint clack that seemed to end the thought. On his way out, he slowed at the oldest corner. He did not get out. He did not want to look at the shallow, pressed shape in the grass. He told himself, There was nothing to be done about that. He told himself he was already doing what could be done. The old woman became part of the route. If dusk found him near the cemetery, he looked for her without admitting to himself that he looked. He came to believe she walked every evening, though he could not prove it. On certain days, the light had a clarity that made every edge too sharp, and on those days he sometimes saw her from farther away, a small figure carrying the weight of the flowers, like a commitment someone else had made for her long ago. Sometimes the bouquet was a handful of ditch blooms, sometimes it was nothing but grass heads. Once she carried no flowers at all, only a folded towel with frayed edges. This last struck him as wrong, not because towels did not belong to the dead, but because towels belonged so completely to the living. Towels meant showers and steaming mirrors and the smell of soap. Towels meant a life still accumulating little damp chores. He began to notice other small wrongness, and once you begin noticing, it is difficult to stop. The mice traps in the shed had gone untouched for a long run of days, then snapped twice in one afternoon. The drinking fountain in the park near the library frothed and hissed without anyone pressing the button, shivering out a thin stream all on its own. He passed a line of streetlights early one morning and found that each one flickered off in sequence as his truck rolled under, as if dimming themselves to spare his eyes. At the grocery store, the register where he brought his milk and bread stuttered oddly, the scanner red eye searching for a barcode in the air and then chirping its success at the blank space over the counter. The cashier slapped the top of the machine with her hand like a person waking someone from a doze. He took his receipt and read it in the cab, the way he sometimes read things he did not care about just to give his eyes work. The bottom line said, "Thank you something something." Beneath that, in the fine print, the letters wavered. He squinted, and the words reassembled into the hours of operation and the return policy. He folded the paper and slid it into the door pocket. Later, when he cleaned the truck, he found it again and could not bring himself to throw it away. He did not know why. He slipped it into the glove box next to old registration slips and tire rotation coupons the clerk had handed him, as if she did not care whether he used them or not. The town sent a notice out by the usual methods that the cemetery would be closing earlier on certain evenings due to clean-up and restoration work in the older section. The notice did not say that people had been seen in the far corner after dark. It did not say anything about the old woman with the flowers. It said shingles and moss and safety. It said paths uneven and roots lifted. It said thank you for your patience. Cal did not know who asked for the notice, but he knew the tone of it, the way the words stacked up in an apology that asked you to agree without feeling you had been asked at all. That evening, he stood by the gate with the town clerk, a woman who used to work at the hardware store and still smelled faintly of fertilizer when she got nervous. They were supposed to turn away visitors after a certain hour. The clerk had a clipboard and a pen, which made everything feel more official than it was. The light sank, taking its time the way a tired man lowers himself into a chair. The sky over the mill tallied up carbon smoke and sent the residue west. One couple arrived with a small pot of marigolds and a confession in their eyes. The clerk told them gently. Later, a pair of teenagers came and left without trying to argue, their faces blank with a relief they would not be asked to explain. The streetlights winked on one by one in a neat mechanical progress toward the river. Cal's chest, where his breath lived, felt as if it had been laced a little too tight. He saw her from down the block, the flowers a pale halo in the failing light. He felt the clerk's body stiffen beside him. She took a step forward and then stopped, maybe at the tilt of Cal's head, or at something in his posture that asked her not to go. The old woman walked on, eyes soft, not looking to either side. When she reached the gate, she paused and looked at the sign the clerk had taped there. Her eyes moved side to side across the lines, but her mouth did not change. She lifted her eyes to Cal, and this time she did not look through him. She looked at him the way you look at a door you have used your whole life, and today it does not open under your hand. The clerk cleared her throat. She started to say something about hours. The old woman raised one hand, not in refusal, not in threat, simply as if balancing the air. Cal heard his own voice before he knew he had decided to use it. He heard the small, smooth throat of it, like he had slid into a familiar shirt without thinking. He said that the older section needed light and careful steps, and he could walk with her if she liked. The clerk cut her eyes toward him with a look that held a stack of questions, then seemed to stack them somewhere else for later. The old woman did not answer. She simply waited. Cal unlatched the gate and held it open, and the three of them entered the grounds to a hush that was not a hush. The wind was present, and the long, low groan of one of the oaks settling its weight, and the far-off bell from the freight yard that marked nothing in particular. But the places between the sounds filled with something that made his back feel very straight. They walked slow enough that he could count the cracks in the path between each step, though he did not count, not with numbers, only with the rhythm of it. The row of new stones reflected the last light. A small bird hopped twice and then flew from the base of a temporary vase. The clerk walked behind them, pen clamped in her fist, as if it might become a tool for something more than writing. When they reached the oldest corner, the light fell a little faster, as if the oaks strained it and kept some for themselves. The old woman went to the same low stone. Cal could tell by the way her shoulders dropped that she had arrived. She knelt with a stiff grace. The bouquet lay against the base of the marker. He saw now what he had not seen before. The flowers were not damp or dusty. They were clean the way a kitchen dish towel is clean, used carefully and rinsed immediately, hung to dry straight. Their stems showed no crush from the hand. Their petals were cool and uniform, the pale of them like the underbellies of fish. He wanted to touch them, to see if the nerves of a plant still lived there. The old woman settled herself on the ground beside the stone. She let out a breath that, in another person, at another time, might have been called content. Cal felt the clerk shift behind him, a small intake, the beginning of a say. He lifted one hand to quiet her, though he did not look back. He kept his eyes on the old woman because to look away would feel like breaking a small promise he had not known he had made. She lay down on the grass. The move held no drama. It was a careful arrangement, a body remembering how to fit into a place made for it. Her coat pulled up a little and exposed the bony line of her wrist, the skin there thin and pale, under it a filigree of veins that made her both breakable and entirely present. Cal felt a pressure in his teeth, the sensation you get when a storm comes on and the air takes on weight. The old woman's face tilted slightly toward the ground. There was no sound of earth moving. There was no shift of dirt. Nothing swallowed her. She rested there and her eyes closed. The clerk's breath behind him took on a shortness and a pace that might have grown into panic if it had anywhere to go. Cal reached out and placed his hand, without quite letting his weight fall, on the ground where the mark of a body had pressed it flat. The grass felt normal. The dirt felt the temperature of late day. But there was something else underneath, a softness that did not belong to roots or to rodent tunnels. It felt like a cotton batting tucked under a quilt, giving just enough to make a shape comfortable. They stayed until the light was gone in a way that made it not just dark, but something more complicated. Cal stood and watched until his calves burned, not because he needed to witness something for himself, but because he felt that if he left, a balance would tip, and something he did not have words for would go spilling. At last, the clerk pulled at his sleeve. She spoke in a voice too thin and too loud. She said his name, and then, after a short hitch, she said they could not keep the gate open any longer. He nodded and stepped back and hated himself for the relief that came with the motion of leaving. As they walked away, the old woman did not move. Cal looked over his shoulder and saw only the faint pale of the bouquet and the small, darker shape of the coat, and the rest of the corner given over to shadows full of shape he did not want to give language. At home, the refrigerator's hum seemed to have learned a new note. There was a small sputter near the end of each cycle, a cough that made him think of dirt settling against a hollow. He peeled his shirt over his head, and the smell of cut grass came with it, though he had showered at the community center and washed good. The towel he had brought from home and hung on a hook in the locker room had not dried the way towels usually do. It had held cold for too long, and then it had gone stiff with a smell like a basement. He had bent it against itself and felt the fibers protest. Now, the towel over the back of the chair had the same smell, as if a thin seam opened in the air and pulled damp up from somewhere no mop could reach. For a few days, the cemetery remained officially closed at dusk, though the clerk did not stand with him at the gate again. He found notes folded in the door jamb at the shed from people who wanted to be let in late. He found scrawled complaints about the hours, complaints about the ruts, about the way the edges of the lawn along the older section had a brown cast that signaled bad soil or too much shade. He found one note that simply said, "Stop it." He told himself the note belonged to a teenager or to someone who saw an argument misplaced and bored into the easiest surface. He began to think of the old woman as a condition, like fog or frost, something that came and went and always took the same amount of space in the day. If he watched for her, he saw her. If he did not, he felt the place in his mind where she would be, and that place grew sore when left empty too long. He could not say why the thought comforted him. It should have made him feel less in control. Instead, it gave him a sense of being carried along a slow current he did not have to fight. The town issued another notice, this time about a sinkhole along a private lane out beyond the mill, and for a day, Cal worked with the backhoe, bringing in clean fill, packing it down with the machine's foot, then rolling over it with the truck, then doing it again because the ground kept taking what he gave and asking for more. At each pass, the void gave a sound like a throat swallowing. He pushed the bed of the pickup and listened to the gravel slide, a dry river, and he smelled the powder of it rise, a smell like chalk and old plaster. When they finally left the lane, the surface looked correct, the way a bandage looks flat and smooth. It told him nothing about what it covered. He drove from the lane to the cemetery without telling himself that was where he was going. He parked outside the wall because something in him had decided the truck did not belong inside anymore unless it had to be. He walked the perimeter, his boots biting the gravel. He reached the far corner and stopped at the fence, fingers hooking the chain like a person spaced out watching a ball game. The old stone waited under the oaks. From the roadside, he could not read the name, but in his head, the letters formed themselves. He tried to picture the old woman's house, though he did not know where she came from when she made her walk. He envisioned a cottage near the river, with a thinning lilac bush and a porch with a sag. He realized then that he had been told a story. He did not know who told it. He did not know how it had slipped into the town's mouth so cleanly that now it felt not told but remembered. That night the compressor on his refrigerator clicked off, and the silence afterward felt heavy. Not like the absence of sound, but like a pressure lying across the counters. He stood there in the kitchen with his hand on the handle and knew if he opened it, the light might not come at once, and another part of him knew the light might come so fast it would feel like the door had been waiting for him, which in its own way would be worse. He let go of the handle. He went into the living room and sat and could not make himself turn on the television. He could not accept that noise into the room. The upstairs neighbor's cat rolled its marble once, twice, the sound distinct enough to count. He tried to remember the last true, open laugh he had let out and came up blank. That was the moment he suspected he had been carrying a pocket of someone else's breath. It had weight. It did not belong to him. When sleep finally found him, it found him cranked. He perched on the edge of it, like a man who cannot commit to stepping off a high platform. In the grey hour, footsteps passed along the sidewalk beneath his window. They were not light, they were not heavy, they were paced. He sat up in bed, bare feet to the cool wood floor, and listened. In his mind, he saw the old woman's shoulder tilt through the gate. He saw the flowers balanced like a small cargo against the work of walking. He pressed his palms against his eyes until colors flashed. He found himself halfway dressed before he knew he had decided. He took his keys from their hook by the door, and the jingle of them felt too loud, a glass sound in the soft belly of morning. The street had the washed-out look it gets when the sky has not yet decided to brighten. He stood for a moment with his hand on the stair rail and breathed air that smelled like the inside of the stone walls along Mill Road after rain, damp, mineral, a little like sweat. He walked without rushing, but without the slow of his usual shuffle. The roads were empty, but the absence of cars did not feel like space. It felt like something withheld. When he reached the cemetery, the gate sat with its sign fluttering. The words about closing hours made their usual apology to the quiet air. Cal lifted the latch. It did not stick at all. It moved like something eager to be used. He stepped inside. The grass felt damp through the soles of his boots. A bird somewhere made a single questioning sound and decided against another. The path through the older section had a sheen as if the night had rubbed its hands along it. He found his way without thinking, and then had a start at the realization that he had not needed to think. He knew the cracks. He knew the tilt sideways of a certain stone just ahead of the oak. He knew the place where the ground had given a little under his hand. When he reached the old stone with its low name, there was no one there. The bouquet from the evening before lay against the base with the neatness of domestic work finished. The pressed shape in the grass seemed newer, smoother, ironed by a warm hand. Cal stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at that shape until his eyes watered from the effort not to blink. Behind him, the sound of the gate latch dropped home. He did not turn. He knew it was a sound that could mean everything and could mean nothing. He had come to accept that sounds could be both. He thought of the sinkhole on the lane out beyond the mill. He thought of how good it had looked when they left and how wrong the earth had sounded while it took what they gave. He looked at the pressed mark and felt an urge to lie down beside it, not out of sorrow, not out of madness, but out of a practical need to test the surface. He wanted to know how it held. He did not lie down. He crouched and set his palm to the grass the way he had before, and waited. The ground had that same inland sea feel, that same gentle sway that would fool you into thinking it was your own blood making the pulse, and not the world telling you it had one. He lifted his hand. He stood and stepped back. He found himself tallying the weight of his body as if the numbers mattered. He remembered, with a sudden and useless rush, how his father once packed soil around a sapling in their yard, hands cupping the trunk, pressing the earth in small circles to make it sure. The sapling had died anyway in a hard winter, and his father had taught him something about care that he had not understood until that moment in the cemetery. That sometimes care was only a set of movements you repeated, because not repeating them would make you feel wrong. A soft noise came from under the ground near the old stone. It was not a voice. If you had to name it, you might call it a settling. The suggestion of it reached up through his boots. He stepped back another pace. The urge to lie down returned, angrier now, a pull more than an idea. He pictured putting his cheek against the mown grass, feeling the stubble prickle his skin, smelling the mix of cuttings and dirt and the faint sour of something older. He pictured what his breath would do against the ground, how it would fog a spot, how that fog would vanish into the green. He realized with a shock that what he feared was not disappearance. He feared being held. He left by the far path as if a different route would change the conclusion. He closed the gate behind him and listened as the latch took the post. It was a good sound, well made. It did not comfort him. The sun finally took the lid off the morning then, and light slid thin between buildings. He went home and rinsed the thermos and watched the water rope from its mouth into the sink, a long, narrow mirror. When he turned it upside down to dry, the last drops hung longer than they should have and refused to fall. He left them there and walked away. That afternoon, the clerk appeared in the shed doorway with a stack of loose papers held like a bundle of kindling against her chest. She did not enter. She leaned on the jamb and told him, in a tone too flat to be casual, that there had been questions about the notice, about letting someone in, about making exceptions that created trouble. She said the word optics as if it were a small, bitter thing that had reached her tongue by accident. Cal wiped his hands on a rag and said he understood. He did. He understood that the structures that kept a place working were not built to accommodate old women who lay down and breathed into the earth, and he also understood that those same structures tended to flex in the quiet places without anyone noticing, and that those flexes kept the bigger pieces from snapping. The clerk handed him the papers without meeting his eyes. He set them on the workbench and did not look at them again. For the rest of that week, he kept himself near the center of town. He fixed a storm drain grate along Main that had been jiggling like a loose tooth. He reseated a bench at the bus stop that someone had loosened by bouncing. He welcomed the tasks that had ends, jobs that told you when you had finished by changing shape under your hands. He thought of the sinkhole. He thought of the soft feel of the earth by the old stone. He told himself he thought of these things because he needed to know how to do his job properly. If the ground was changing, it meant his work would change also. This was a true reason. The other reason walked in his head with a bouquet and did not explain itself. On the last evening of that week, a storm came up coppery and fast. The sky hung low as a lid. The wind went mean. Rain stalked across the street in lines and then fell sideways for a while. Cal sat in the truck because there was nowhere else to sit. The wipers made their long, low swipe, and the rubber tired of it. He went toward the cemetery, pulled by something that had the weight of choice and the weight of the lack of choice at the same time. He parked beneath an oak near the wall and stayed in the cab until the rain let go its hard edge and turned to a steady pour. When he got out, it hit him like a washing, and he could not keep the grin from scratching at his mouth. Rain made sense. It had a purpose, and it knew how to do it. He opened the gate. The iron latch offered no resistance. The paths ran shallow with water, small rivers racing themselves along the compacted gravel. In the far corner, the ground under the oaks drank faster than the rest. He stood there in the downpour and stared at the low stone and smelled the turned earth and breathed as if he had been running. Then he saw, beyond the marker, not exactly in front of it, but off to the side, a dark oval where the grass had peeled away in a posture of surrender. The rain thickened the dark. The lip of it held for a moment, and then the oval deepened until it was a mouth. Cal did not move. Water ran from his hair and down the collar of his coat and into the line of his spine. The mouth did not widen. It simply deepened as if a heavy shape had shifted under the surface toward it. He took one step forward because this was his work. He took another because this was not. He crouched again the way he had that morning and let his hand find the edge. The soil felt slick and it slurred away under his touch. The hole drew a little more and then stopped as if reassured. Cal drew his hand back and studied the line of wet across his skin. He tasted it without thinking. A habit from childhood when dirt was still a thing you put in your mouth just to know it. It tasted like iron and something else that did not belong to any metal. It tasted like time. He was aware then of someone standing to his right. He did not start. He knew it was her before he turned. She stood with no umbrella, no hood, hair matted in thin grey ropes against her forehead. She held no bouquet. Her empty hands hung calm at her sides. Water sheeted down her face and did not seem to trouble her eyes. Cal stood. It felt wrong to crouch in front of her like a supplicant, though he could not have said why. She looked from his face to the place where his hand had been and back. He found his voice and did not know what he meant to use it for. He said her name, a test of something. Her mouth moved as if to shape a confession, or a complaint, or a recipe. Then it did not. They stood in the rain until they were both soaked clean through. A piece of bark loosed itself high in one of the oaks and ticked from branch to branch until it struck the ground with a sound like a small knuckle. The old woman lifted one hand and pointed at the stone. Then she made a slight, almost invisible motion with her fingers, like smoothing a bedsheet. Cal understood a single thing in that moment that he could not have learned any other way. He understood that action as a ritual and also as a job. Her hand had done it too many times for it to belong only to grief. It belonged to maintenance. He nodded, and without agreement and without refusal, he knelt and pressed the earth along the lip of the hole. The soil answered. It held. He pressed small circles, the way you tamp around a new plant so it will not loosen in the rain. The old woman sighed, but not as a sign of ease. It was a sigh that acknowledged work completed correctly. Cal felt the relief of doing something the way it should be done. He did not ask the question that rose in his throat. He knew in the way of knowing that questions were not part of this exchange. He stayed there until the rain softened, until the mouth had become a smooth oval again, more like a pressed shape than a violated one. When his legs trembled, he stood and wiped his hands on his coat, because there was nothing else to do. He looked at the old woman and found her watching him, not with gratitude and not with relief, but with an attention he had never seen direct itself at him before. She held him in it until he felt a weight press on his ribs. Then she nodded, a small motion that sealed something he could not name, and she turned away. She walked toward the gate with the same balanced steps she always used. When she reached the path where the new stones brightened in the weak leftover light, she seemed to vanish a little into the ordinary world again, the way someone does when they step from shade into light and then into the shadow of the next tree, and your eyes cannot quite keep up. Cal went home to his quiet rooms and the towel that still would not dry right. He made a sandwich he did not want and ate it at the sink. The refrigerator hummed and coughed exactly once. He did not sleep. He watched his own breathing in the dark, the rise and fall like a quiet wave. He tried to count, but numbers refused him, and what he counted instead were small, unaccountable facts. The chipped rim of his favorite mug, the way the traffic light at the corner held red too long when no one waited on the cross street, the slight electricity of his skin where the rain had cooled it too fast. He lay there and felt the town settle itself around him, and he knew he had taken a step he could not walk back from, and yet he did not know toward what. Near dawn, the sound came again, the hollow thud from far below. A door closing in a house with a dirt floor and walls made of time. He lay still, he listened. It came again, softer, as if doubled by distance. He closed his eyes. He placed the old woman's hand, smoothing the bedsheet in his mind, and fell into a sleep that did not refresh, but did not punish either. He sank in it the way the ground sinks when you have pressed circles with your palms until it is ready to take a weight. The public notice went up on a pale morning that felt emptied out, like the town had been shaken and half the small belongings of weather and sound had slipped under the bed. The clerk taped fresh pages to the gate with her jaw set. Cal stood by, not as guard and not as friend, but as someone whose presence made the scene appear legitimate. The page said instability and safety and temporary closure of the older grounds. It listed an email address for questions. It did not mention Elara Thorne. It did not mention the low-pressed shape in the grass. It did not mention the small oval that had become a mouth and then had been smoothed back to a shape you could show to a child without scaring them. People arrived in a stagger of motives. Grief, habit, curiosity, that species of small-town sport where you go to see how the rules apply to you and whether they bend if you tilt your head the right way. Cal let the clerk do the talking. He learned the faces of those who would accept a delay and those who found any delay an insult. A man with a Joker-esque grin tried to step around them and then laughed and backed off when he felt the quiet of Cal Leger's body. A woman in a neat jacket asked for the contact for the county. She used words like liability. She looked at Cal as if he were a stone in the road. When she left, the clerk sighed and said she would call someone on a list and say something that sounded like the town was already doing what the county required. Cal nodded. He knew all the ways people told each other that nothing could be done while doing something anyway. They walked the path together to check the corners, though neither of them wanted to, not really. The oaks made a sound like a low whisper, the dry side of it reminding Cal of the sound a receipt makes when it curls from a printer. He could feel the shape of the hole under the ground, even with the soil tamped. The way a man waiting in the next room sometimes adjusts his foot and you sense him through the wall. The clerk paused at the low stone and looked at the pressed oval. She made a small noise in her throat, less than a word, more than a breath. Then she bent and straightened the bouquet that had slouched. Her hands were careful. He had not expected that. At the shed that afternoon, a thin man from the county came with a measuring wheel and a clipboard and a bright vest that had never seen the inside of a truck bed. He asked questions in a tone light enough to suggest that no answers were required. He nodded at Cal's replies like each one confirmed a fact he had already written. He said ground conditions change, with water tables that move and clay that swells and shrinks and organic pockets that break down and leave voids. He said this the way a preacher says a verse and waits for the congregation to breathe in and accept it as a whole. Cal nodded because he knew the words as a list of pieces all true, and yet he also knew that when mixed together they made a soup that did not match the taste of what he had put his hands into. They stood by the gate while the county man wrote in his small, tight hand. The pens they give to such people have a certain scratch. Cal could identify it from across a room now, the sound of a decision being shaped. The man said they should keep the older section closed until further notice. He said, further notice, as if it were a day that would arrive with a calendar page peeling off its nail, and not a phrase that sometimes meant never. He shook Cal's hand and departed with the wheel clicking like a toy behind him. The clerk watched him go and said nothing. She took the tape from her pocket and smoothed the corners of the notice. Her hands made the same motion the old woman's had made, and Cal felt the breath leave his chest in a slow, quiet emptying. In the evenings, light set itself against the wall of cloud and then went out like a store sign at closing. Cal began to walk in those hours. He told himself he was inspecting. He told himself he was making sure no one ignored the notice. What he did was pace the perimeter until his mind took on the rhythm of fence posts passing. The old woman did not come every evening. When she came without flowers and with a towel draped over her forearm in the neat fold you use when you keep a good towel for guests. Cal watched her from the road, and then when watching felt both wrong and necessary, he let himself through the gate and joined her the way a maintenance man joins someone he recognizes, because to walk apart would make the scene look like trouble. They spoke almost not at all. Once, as they stood at the low stone, she looked at the smooth oval, and then at him, and said in a voice that seemed to have been worn flat by the pressing of too many words in an older time, that the name used to mean something about thorns and stones and fields lying fallow. He wanted to ask her how she knew that. He wanted to ask her if she had known Elara when the world was younger and names felt like tools you carried from one season to the next. He said nothing. He stood until their standing became the act, and then he walked her to the gate as if escorting a visiting official, and then he went home and sat in the chair by the window and watched the evening not darken so much as thicken. His apartment settled into a series of small wrongnesses that were too trivial to claim fear, but too persistent to ignore. The refrigerator's hum added another note near the back of each cycle, a deep rumble that suggested something turning in the walls. The bath towel never fully dried between showers and picked up a tang like river stones. The mug with the chip on the rim tasted of pennies, no matter how hard he scrubbed, no matter that he switched soaps. The neighbor's cat took to rolling its marble at odd hours, a steady, slow roll that traveled the length of the room and bumped the baseboard with a click and then sat still, as if waiting for him to retrieve it. He answered none of these phenomena with any wisdom. He fitted them into his days with the care of a man lining old newspapers in a drawer. On a morning that opened clear and bright as a peeled apple, the answering machine in the shed winked at him with that small, faithful red eye. He pressed the button with his thumb and listened to the usual run of requests. A broken lock at the Nature Trail restroom, a question about a permit for a volunteer cleanup along the river, the coach again with his worry about lines on the field. Then came the voice from before, old and careful, the one that had said his name once and the word gate. Now it said only the second word, but it said it twice, and the second time it bent the vowel in a way that made it sound closer to get. Cal felt a line snap deep in him and then hold, a sound like wire under strain. He erased the message and then could not say why he had done that, except that hearing it again would make it true in a way that the first pass had not. He walked to the gate on his lunch hour and found a cheap bouquet propped against the latch, the cellophane wet with condensation inside. Someone had left it like a question, daring an answer. The flowers had the thrift of a convenience counter, bright and a little strained. He took them inside because he could not think of leaving them where they were, half in and half out. He carried them along the path like contraband. The older corner waited with its patience and its invisible heave. He set the bouquet at the low stone and felt silly, as if he had misread the rules to a game where everyone else had known them since childhood. Then, because the motion had weight, he pressed the earth along the oval with those small circles he had learned with his palms, and the ground acknowledged him with a subtle shift he could not have explained to anyone. The bouquet's cellophane crackled in the quiet like a whisper he did not want and could not escape. He noticed then that the edges of other graves, ones farther out from the oaks, had sagged. Not collapsed, not even a sink, only a soft, irregular slant that suggested breath. He knelt by one and pressed the turf with his fingers and found the same give, the same slight draw. He spoke under his breath, not names, not prayers, just the small holds of language that keep a person from talking to himself in a way that gets noticed. He pressed where the line dipped. He smoothed. He moved on. He did this until he felt the backs of his thighs burn and his shoulders argue. When he finally stood, the section looked more orderly in a way that would not be measured by any wheel on a stick, and he felt in his ribs a little release, the way a tight band loosens when you breathe. In the days that followed, he found edges everywhere. The bus stop bench listed an inch toward the gutter and did not list back. The manhole covers wrapped under truck tires with a hollow note, as if the ground beneath had hollowed only a finger's depth, enough to change the percussion of passing. The floor in his kitchen gave when he crossed it in the night for water, a long, slow flex that did not alarm him, but did not feel innocent either. In the grocery store, a cashier had to unplug and replug her scanner twice, and each time it chirped against the empty air, catching barcodes that were not there and producing receipts for invisible purchases, the paper printing neat rows of zeros where numbers should be. Cal took one of these misfired slips from the trash and studied it in his truck until the letters drifted into blanks. Then he pressed the paper flat and tucked it into the glove box. With the others he could not throw away because they felt connected to something that might need proof later. The clerk stopped by while he was replacing a broken plank on a picnic table and told him that complaints had accumulated about the cemetery staying closed. She said she had done what she could. She said the committee had ideas. She made a face when she said ideas. They wanted to put up new chain. They wanted to hire a part-time person who would close the gate early and stand there longer than anyone should in the damp. They wanted signs with more red on them. Cal hammered the nail and said it was the ground and not the people that determined what would hold. She looked at him and exhaled through her teeth and said she knew that. Knowing did not mean you got to use the truth. That night a train slipped through the edge of town and dragged its long tail of noise behind it, the kind that makes windows soft around their frames. Cal sat up in bed, heart working as if he had been running. He listened for the now familiar thud from beneath, the door shutting in the underground house of his sleep. It came, softer than usual, and then did not come again. He lay on his back and counted heartbeats until the count fell apart, and his mind wandered to the way the old woman smoothed the ground as if tucking in someone who had kicked off their covers. He shut his eyes and tried to imagine her house again, a place where towels never dried and the refrigerator had something alive in its hum, and the cat never settled, only rolled its marble back and forth, waiting for the ground to agree to hold it steady. He began to carry a short-handled tamper in the truck, the tool they used for packing around posts and repairing low spots at the base of swings. He did not list it on any work order. He did not tell the clerk. He parked outside the wall in the late day and walked in with the tamper balanced on his shoulder like a stick. He pressed around the trouble spots in the older section and then in the new. He tamped gently along the path edges where the gravel had slumped. He worked by feel more than by sight, the way he would level a stone set in a path by the way it talked back to his hammer. As he worked, he noticed a pattern. The places that wanted pressing most were not random. They formed a subtle line leading from the wall to the oldest corner and then beyond, toward the fence where sumac had taken a bite out of the property and held it. He followed that soft line, tamping as he went, until he reached the fence and stood with his hands on the mesh and looked at the lot beyond, a narrow wedge of land the town had not owned for a long time. There, under a tangle of brambles, the ground was not soft at all. It was hard and stubborn, the way ground gets when it has forgotten any part of water or roots. On a windy afternoon, the old woman did not appear, and he thought he had misjudged the rhythm of her days. He was leaving when the latch clicked behind him, and she came through with a slow push, a towel folded neat again, and a small bundle wrapped in brown paper under her elbow. She moved as if the wind did not pertain to her. He felt a sudden, unaccountable gladness at the sight of her hands full. He should have been angry at what he was allowing himself. He did not feel anger. He felt only a sense that some small job was about to be done, and he happened to be the person available to do it. At the low stone, she set the brown bundle down and unwrapped it. Inside lay a butter knife with an old patterned handle, and a handful of wooden wedges the size of doorstops, and a small roll of twine that had been folded back on itself until it had taken on the shape of the pocket where she kept it. Cal watched her, not as a man watches a stranger, but as a maintenance worker watches a more experienced hand and waits to see the trick that will make a task stop fighting him. She slid the wedges under the edge of the turf where it had drooped. She tied the twine around stems that had fallen apart and made them into a single tidy bouquet again. She used the butter knife to cut a piece of sod that had stretched and brought it back into line. He could not say why this moved him so deeply. The tools were humble and wrong for the job, but they did it anyway, and that felt like a kind of forgiveness you do not expect in a place full of endings. She looked up, and a question sat on her face, not asked aloud. He lifted the tamper and showed it with a small shrug. She nodded, and he tamped gently along the edge she had trimmed with the knife, and the ground came up to meet the blade, and then his foot, and then the flat of the iron, and did not retreat. After, she folded the towel again, the way you do when you make a ritual, and tucked the knife and wedges into the brown paper. She held the bundle close to her chest, like a loaf still warm. On the path back, she touched his sleeve once, a quick gratitude, and he understood. He had been hired without paperwork, paid in a currency the town did not recognize and the county would forbid. The grocery store lights took on a pulse. Fluorescents always hum, but now and then their ballast gives them a low heartbeat you can feel in your teeth. Cal lingered in the aisles he never lingered in and found himself picking up items he had never bought. A small bag of potting soil that smelled too sweet, a roll of twine, not unlike the old woman's, a stack of towels on sale, thin and bright, that would not absorb anything you asked them to. At the register, the scanner tried to process air again. The cashier slapped it and laughed and apologized and said the power had been strange all week. The receipt printed with the correct words in the places where words go, but the line of the return policy at the bottom blurred and sharpened like a reflection on water. Cal held the paper in his hand and told himself he saw what he had been taught to expect. The clerk called him to the office for a meeting with the committee. They sat in chairs meant for less time than a meeting usually takes, and they wore the faces of people who had already rehearsed their disapproval. They asked him what he had done to cause such concern among certain families. They asked him if he had let anyone in after hours. They asked him whether he understood that the notice had the force of authority, even if no deputy stood by the gate. He said yes to the last one, and nothing to the others, and let the shape of his silence do the showing. The clerk stared at the map on the wall until everybody left, and then she put her palm to her forehead and said she believed him, which is another way of saying the facts did not help, and belief might. Overnight, the town taped off the older section with bright ribbon that snapped in the wind. A boy rode his bike along the edge of it and tested the tape with his fingertips, and Cal moved him along with a look and a kind word that felt like someone else had lent it to him. He took the tamper in during the day now openly, as if the tool had come to resemble a broom, and he pressed without apology in the places that asked. Once he felt the oddest thing, a return pressure from below that answered his tamp the way a wall answers your hand when someone on the other side puts their palm where yours is and tests the thinness of the material between. He drew the tamper back and stood still for a long while and watched shadows move across the grass and listened to the receipt sound of leaves gossiping above him. He looked up Elara in the file drawer at the clerk's office and found only a brittle index card with a lot number and the year the stone had been set, written in a hand that leaned from an old wrist. No birth, no death, no relation paid. In the back of the drawer lay a packet of hard candy that had fused to its wrapper and a rubber band so dry it would crack the second you asked it to stretch. He slid the drawer shut softly, the metal catching for a second on its rail, and felt stupid for hoping that the card would explain anything at all. He did not tell the clerk what he had looked for. He went back to the shed and sharpened the blade on his trimmer and wiped the dust from the ferrule of his shovel and oiled the hinge of the locker door that had squeaked, and these acts put a fine layer of rightness over the rest, like sawdust over a spill. Rain avoided the town for days, and then came all at once, hard and mean, slapping the side of buildings as if to wake them. Cal took the truck out to check drains and found leaves folded into every grate like blankets tucked too tight. He dragged the rake until his shoulders protested. He watched water open throats in lawns and speak them wider. He turned off his radio and worked in the kind of silence that is full of road noise, and the Doppler sigh of tires, and the small pings of gravel in wheel wells. When he finally swung back past the cemetery, the wall glistened like wet bread crust. He parked outside the gate and walked along the path with the tamper like a shepherdess staff. In the oldest corner, the pressed shape had held. Beyond it, two more low ovals asked with a patience he could not refuse. He tamped, he smoothed, He pressed the lip of earth back into shape, and as he pressed, he heard a voice. Yes, but not quite that. More like a movement of air that had once been language and now had only the rhythm. He worked until the old woman's shoulder appeared in the corner of his eye, and he knew he had done enough for that day. She joined him and did not reach for his sleeve this time. She stood with her hands folded before her like a clerk, waiting politely for a customer to finish counting their change. He told her, without planning to, about the sinkhole on the lane beyond the mill, and about the way the ground had taken the fill as if it were hungry, and then had settled as if full but not satisfied. He told her the committee wanted chain. He told her the refrigerator coughed on a new beat now before sleeping. He said these things in the order they had sat in his throat, and she listened with that attention that is its own kind of work. When he stopped, not because he was done, but because the words had run out like gas from a tank, she said only that some weights need place, and that when place is not given, weight moves. He walked home through air that felt rinsed. The traffic light at the corner did its long red again, and then forgot and went green when there were no cars, as if it had remembered a different town from a different time when rules were shaped more by habit than by any electric brain in a steel cabinet. He stood with his hands in his pockets and let the light cycle through its moods, and then he crossed, not because he had the right, but because the road bored of waiting for him. In his kitchen, the floor creaked under his foot once in a pitch he had not heard before. He bent and pressed his palm to the plank the way he pressed the turf. The wood did not answer, and yet he felt better having done it. 2 mornings after the rain, the county sent an email that the clerk printed and pinned to the corkboard in the shed, where notices for pie sales and lost cats also lived. The email said closed for assessment and no exception except for authorized personnel, and a phrase about liability that ran long and held itself together by stubbornness. The clerk tapped the paper with one finger and said she was sorry for the extra trouble. Cal read the lines twice, and then a third time, because the words were so sure of themselves that they made him want to be sure of himself in some equal way. The old woman would not be considered authorized. He knew that. He knew that while also knowing that some people carry their own authority with them, the way a steady person carries a flashlight in a power outage and does not need to ask who is in charge before deciding where to aim the beam. That evening he stood by the gate, old as iron, and wondered if he would turn the old woman away if she came. He stood long enough that he felt foolish, and then that feeling fell away, and something steadier replaced it, a calm, like the one that comes when you decide to do the work, even if the work will not be blessed by any paperwork. She did not appear. He closed the gate with a finger to the latch, the way you touch a lid that has given you a good sound, and thank it without words. He walked the perimeter and saw prints in the soft ground near the wall in a small grouping, not quite feet, not quite animal, none of them deep. The sight made the hair rise along his arms. He told himself kids had crossed there to save steps. He told himself a raccoon had drifted that way. He told himself he believed himself. He did not. Heat came and sat on the town like a sleeping hand. The towels never dried now. The refrigerator's cough settled into a steady cadence. The upstairs neighbor's cat gave up on the marble and took to pacing. Cal drank water from the tap and tasted warm pipe and the ghost of metal and something like wet paper. He ate peanut butter with a spoon over the sink and called it dinner, which is another way to say he did not want to cook, because cooking would fill the rooms with smells that would mark the passage of time. He drove at dawn to the cemetery with the tamper and 2 shovels and the little hand rake that works around headstones carefully. He did not know what he meant to do more than what he had been doing, but he brought more tools the way you bring too many blankets to a cold night when you are not sure if the heat will hold. He found the old woman already there, towel folded, brown paper bundle at her feet, hair pinned back like the day's work would require it. She looked older in the heat, and also not old at all, a contradiction he did not want to stare at. She nodded to him as to someone who clocked in earlier than expected. They went about the work. He tamped and smoothed. She trimmed sod and gathered fallen stems and pressed palm prints into the oval as if to leave just enough of herself that the ground would remember to maintain its shape. At some point, he realized the work had spread past Elara's stone. It had spread past the oaks, past the corner with the sumac pressing its red cones up like a warning, past the newest stones with their dates fresh enough to sting. It had spilled into the paths and the low ditch on the backside and the strip by the fence where the mower shuddered. He pressed without thinking now when he saw the ask. He mended even when there was no one looking. When the sun rose high enough to draw sharp, short shadows, the old woman did something she had not done before. She lay down not beside the low stone, but across the path where one oval had repeated its unmaking twice in 2 weeks. She pressed her cheek to the gravel and made a move with her hand, palm down, as if pressing a restless child to stillness. Cal froze with his tamper held halfway between ground and air. He expected something to break in the silence. Nothing broke. He heard the mill by the river cough and a truck shift gears and wind through a stand of leaves that had not yet had their fill of heat. The old woman turned her face toward him and said very softly that it was not only this corner and not only this place, that weight moves and looks for place, that if you do not give it place, it takes place from where it can. He did not ask what she meant by it when she said, wait. He understood it the way you understand a smell you cannot name but can place to a season. He stood there with the tamper and thought about the sinkhole and the manhole covers and the wooden floor in his kitchen and the towel that never dried and the refrigerator new cough and the cat and the receipt that printed with zeros and then with words that refused to stay put. He saw all these things line up like fence posts in a field he had mowed often enough to know every rock and still knew less than he thought he did. He set the tamper down and pressed the path with his hands the way she had shown him. Small circles, small commitments. The gravel rasped under his palms and answered, and when he stood, the path looked no different. And yet he walked away with the particular relief that comes after you have done something the way it must be done, whether or not the result pleases anyone. The county came back. This time, the man brought another man who wore a hat that made him look official to those who need such hats. They walked the oldest section and prodded the ground with a stick meant for that prodding. They spoke in a code of properties and percentages and compaction rates. Cal stood at a remove, leaning on his shovel the way you lean on a threshold when you do not intend to cross. He heard them say the word remediation. He heard them say the word budget, and then the phrase, not this cycle. He heard them say the word closure again, and then the word indefinite. The second man asked him if he had noticed anything unusual. Cal said the ground had been breathing. He said it just that way. He did not say it to be difficult. He said it because anything else would be a lie. The man wrote something and then said he appreciated the poetic turn of phrase. Cal straightened slowly from his shovel and did not answer. The clerk worried the edge of the notice on the gate until the tape lifted and then pressed it back flat again. That night, the old woman did not come, and the night after that, she did not. And the night after that, she did not. And on the morning of the fourth day, he had counted the days by weather and habit and not by numbers, Cal reached the gate with the tamper on his shoulder and found the towel folded on the latch. No note, no brown paper bundle, no woman. The towel was heavy with damp and smelled like the inside of a drawer that never opens. He lifted it gently and found underneath it the butter knife and the twine and the wedges like doorstops made by a helpful hand from scrap. He held the knife in his palm. The patent handle had once been a flower and was now only a memory of one. He carried the bundle inside like a baton handed off in a race no one had told the spectators was being run. He worked in the older section like a man following a recipe written without measurements. He pressed where the ground asked. He tied where stems leaned. He cut sod where it had stretched. He smoothed with the towel, the fibers leaving the faintest nap polished a little more. The work made him sweat. The towel made his hands smell domestic and sad. He felt the town around him like a sleeping thing that shifts its weight and offers you your own name under its breath, just to see if you will answer. He answered by pressing. He answered by closing the gate carefully when he left. He answered by going home and filling a bowl with water and setting it on the floor for the neighbor's cat on the nights when the marble stopped rolling and he heard it scratch and pace. On a day that began with fog that burned off too quickly and left the sky mean, a funeral arrived at the newer section. Cal kept to the perimeter. He watched the family hover in that tight circle close people make around a thing they will not talk about out loud. He watched the pastor. He knew the man, but not enough to offer his hand. Speak with a voice practiced in the art of making less heavy what cannot be made light. He watched the men from the funeral home tug the straps with hands that had done this enough times to know when the ground had more to say. The straps made a sound as if they resisted more than usual. Cal waited because he could not walk away from this and still have the day make sense. The casket settled with a whisper that was not a whisper. The earth took the weight with a reluctance that would look to others like nothing at all. He felt it in his calves. He felt it in the tight band below his ribs. He pressed his palm against the handle of the tamper and looked to the old corner where the oaks leaned with the patience of big things that do not move quickly, but do move. The family left behind little round sandwiches with their edges trimmed and scraps of ribbon from bouquets and words that hung in the air like steam and then disappeared. Cal walked to the grave when the last person had turned toward the gate and stood and waited, as if waiting would tell him what he should do. The men from the funeral home returned with the astroturf squares they use and the machine that turns the earth, and he stepped back and watched them do their job. When they finished, the surface looked correct and the edges were crisp, and the green squares hid the raw side of what had been done. He told himself it was not his place to feel anything. Then he fetched the towel and pressed the turf along the lip in those small circles, and one of the men watched him with an expression that began a question and forgot to finish it. The towel and the wedges and the knife and the twine came home with him after that. He put them on the small table by the door. The towel took on the smell of the place instantly, an exchange as quick and complete as breath. He found himself smoothing the corners of it as he stepped out and smoothing them when he came back in. The towel lay there like a small agreement. He tried not to think of the old woman. When he did, he pictured her hands adjusting the wedge under his door to let in a narrow band of air and keep other things from slipping in. He noticed then how many places were asking along the routes that were not within the walls of the cemetery. The curb in front of the hardware store heaved and sank like a sleeping flank. The dirt under the swings at the park made little slides of itself toward the low spots where children landed. The backlot behind the feed store, now the used furniture shop, had a corner where the asphalt had turned soft as cake. He could not carry the tamper everywhere without drawing commentary. He used his boots and his hands where he could. He patted earth around the base of the stop sign that had leaned in a posture too casual for a sign. He set his palm against the brick of a chimney on a roof he had no reason to climb, but had climbed anyway to get to a branch he had told the clerk he needed to cut. He pressed and waited and let the small tension in his chest slip a fraction. On an afternoon with light so bright the tops of cars looked cut out and pasted on, he sat in his truck outside the cemetery and fought with himself. He knew if he walked in with the tamper again, during the hours the county had claimed, someone would mention it at the meeting. He knew if he did not walk in, the ground would ask someone else, or would do without the help and shift in a moodier way. The old towel on the seat beside him smelled like a basement upstate. He lifted it and put it on his shoulder and felt the weight like a hand. He went in. He tamped the old corner. He tamped beyond it. He followed that subtle line he had found before, the one that ran beyond the wall and toward the wedge of land the town did not own. He squeezed through the place where the chain link had given up pretending to be whole. He stood in the bramble, the dried heads of last year's growth scratching his jeans, the sumac smelling like sour fruit. He pressed the ground with his boot and felt the pushback not at all. He cut with the butter knife at a bit of sod that had crept under the fence by migration more than by planting. The dirt here was hard and dry and not interested in breath. He felt a rage at this refusal that frightened him for how quickly it lit and how quickly it passed. He stepped back across the fence and felt the ground relax again in that way he had come to think of as a conversation. When he left, he ran into the man with the hat at the gate. The man put a hand on the latch as if he could anchor a rule there. He asked Cal what he was doing inside when the notice said closed until further notice. Cal said he had been checking the fence line for holes and making sure no one had come in who should not. This was true in all the ways that matter. The man with the hat did not look at the towel on Cal's shoulder or the dirt printed on the knee of his jeans. He looked at Cal's eyes as if looking past him to the oaks where shade had gathered and refused to leave. Then he said he would need to be notified of any new changes. He said he did not want surprises. Cal nodded and managed not to laugh at the word want in that sentence. The man tipped his hat with 2 fingers and walked away. The latch fell into place with a sound that belonged to a well-made thing. The old woman returned just once more. It was early and not yet hot. She came walking slow, not with the measured pace of before, but with the light, uncertain step of someone testing ice. He almost ran to her and almost did not. He settled for meeting her halfway. She did not carry the towel or the bundle. Her hands were empty and a little spread, palms up, as if she had expected to find something in them and had not. She looked at him and smiled a small, hopeless smile and then turned toward the old corner. He followed, feeling like a boy allowed into a room he had been shooed out of his whole life. At the stone she knelt. She laid her palms flat on the grass and held them there and lowered her head and listened. Cal did not breathe, for fear his breath would be louder than the sound she sought. After a long while, she sat back on her heels and looked at him with eyes that had gone someplace and returned and were not quite done with the trip. She said that sometimes the ground wants to keep what it is given, and sometimes the ground wants to give it back in a form you do not recognize until too late. She looked again at the oval and then at him, and he saw for the first time not oldness but wear. The kind tools show honest and unavoidable. And she stood with a slow push of her hands against her knees and went to the gate as if she had forgotten something on the stove. He did not stop her. He felt he might not see her again, and accepted this the way you accept that a storm moving away has chosen a different town to correct for something only it understands. He did not see her again. In the quiet that followed, the days lengthened and the work spread. He found himself tamping near the creek where the bank had always crumbled and now crumbled with intention. He tamped behind the post office where the gravel lot had softened. He tamped the strip of land along the tracks where weeds had made a home of neglect. He tamped the edges of his own door in the apartment where the frame seemed to sag and the latch refused to catch unless coaxed. He tamped with hands on wood and with the flat of the knife under loose paper on the wall and with the heel of his palm against the refrigerator when it hummed itself too alert to sleep. He pressed, and the world pressed back, and between the two pressures lay a strange calm, like the quiet of a house when someone has stepped out and left their breath behind. More funerals came. He learned the names on the new stones out of a habit that had never been his before. He smoothed their edges and felt less like a trespasser each time. People began to nod at him as if he belonged there for reasons beyond municipal employment. Now and then someone left a folded towel with a small ribbon tied around it at the gate, and he lifted it and brought it inside, as if that were the mailbox for such offerings. The clerk never asked him about the towels. She did not ask him about the twine or the wedges or the butter knife that lived in his pocket now where the utility knife used to be. She came to the gate sometimes and stared at the notice, and then at the oaks, and then at the older corner, and then at Cal, and then she said something about the council meeting, and then she went away with her hands full of papers. On a night when the town felt empty as a washed dish and the far lot by the mill filled with a roll of fog that had the density of sheep wool, Cal dreamed without sleeping. He saw the old corner open like the mouth it had been, and then close and then open, and saw a shape rise and then settle and then rise again. He did not recognize the shape as human, and then did not care whether it was. He woke with his hands pressed flat on the mattress, as if tamping his own bed. He laughed once, a dry bark he had not made in months. He stood and drank water that tasted like little coins that had been in too many hands. The thud from below, the one that was a door and also not a door, grew clearer as the nights warmed. Sometimes it came twice in a row, the second softer, like an echo turned from sound into touch. He timed nothing. He did not think in hours. He had only the motions of the day anchored to the town's hungry routines, the stoplights long red, the mill's cough, the few bars that stayed open old past any liquor license's patience, the garbage truck's hydraulic hiss like a beast sleeping and waking. Between these markers he set his own, the press of dirt, the smoothing of towel, the slight lift of turf under his thumb when it wanted to pull away. Toward the end of that heat, the town put up a second notice on the gate drawn up by the county's lawyer, its sentences long enough to trip a person who tried to walk them. It said restricted and violation and penalty of something that came across more like a threat than a promise. Cal read each line and set the paper back and smoothed it and did not alter his pace. That evening he watched two men in good shoes come to the gate, read the paper, and look toward the oldest corner with the special appetite men, like that always bring to small places when they smell an angle. He waited. He did not open. They left with their jackets a little more wrinkled than when they had arrived. Fall crept in sideways, not with leaves changing in a blaze, but through a thinning of the air and a sharpening of smells. The towels dried almost, a mercy that felt earned and temporary. The refrigerator learned to give its cough later in the evening as if respecting his own hours. The cat upstairs rolled the marble at odd times again, like a machine testing itself. Cal tamped in the early dark now with the mist gathering at ankle height. Sometimes, working in the older section, he would hear footsteps on the path and straighten and find no one, and then, a minute later, hear the catch of the latch, and know he had not imagined it, because certain sounds belong to metal and cannot be faked by fog. He had made a habit of laying his hand on the low stone named Elara at the end of each session, palm flat, a simple acknowledgement. He did it that evening and felt, for the first time, a warmth come up through the stone, gentle as breath. He did not pull away. He let his hand sit there until the warmth passed, not because he enjoyed it, but because he had learned not to argue with those moments. He lifted his hand, and the stone felt like any other stone, and he went to the gate and closed it carefully and walked home a longer route so that his feet would pass by the places he had pressed outside the walls and reassure him with the small give and push of ground that had accepted his terms for another day. On the night before the first frost, the answering machine in the shed blinked twice and then went steady and would not play. He tapped it with a knuckle. It coughed and spit out a spool of tape, and then swallowed it again, and then the light went dark, and in that dark he felt the peculiar relief of something that has tried to tell you enough times, and at last recognizes you have learned what it had to say. He lifted the plug and touched the prongs, and here he could have claimed a mild shock, but he did not. It was only the memory in his fingers of what a shock should feel like. He plugged it back in. The light stayed off. He wiped his palm on his jeans and left the shed door ajar for the air. That evening he took the tamper to the cemetery with the composure he had not had in months. He did not look for the old woman. He no longer needed her to set his pace. He went to the oldest corner and set the bare heel of his hand to the edge of the pressed oval and felt it ask. He asked himself, not for the first time, what would happen if he did not answer. He did not like the picture that came. The old stones leaning a little more, the paths going ragged, the new graves sinking faster than families could make peace with, the town's frames loosening, window by window, door by door, every latch a little less sure, every floor making a syllable that sounded like a word you cannot quite hear. He pressed, he tamped, he made his small circles with his palms. When his back complained, he stood straight and stared up into the high dark where the oaks had carried their leaves farther into the season than usual. He thought, not for the first time, that weight wants place for reasons beyond grief. He thought about the way people here had always held things down, old photographs under glass, quilts stitched so tight they remembered a body long after it left the bed, jars sealed against a winter that came whether you named it or not. He thought of the old woman's towel folded on the latch like a permission slip no one had signed. The gate latch clicked. The sound now had a shape in his mind. It did not surprise him. Footsteps moved along the path with a human weight and then stopped a little way off, and he knew by the quiet that followed it was someone who did not know yet what they had come to ask. He did not turn. He finished the circle he had begun. When he did turn, it was to find the clerk standing there with her hands buried in the pockets of her coat, as if to keep them from doing something they should not. She looked at the oval, and then at him, and then at the towel on his shoulder, and then back at the oval. She said his name the way a person says it when they want to pull you back from a place that might open under you. He said her name back the way a person says it when he knows he will not be pulled. She swallowed and said, "There would be talk." He said there already had been. She nodded. She took her hands from her pockets and knelt and pressed both palms flat on the grass as he had done. And when she stood, he saw that she had made no more of a dent than he ever had, and yet had given the same answer anyway. He walked her to the gate. She held the latch and looked at him for a long count of nothing, and then she went out, and he stayed, and then he went out, and he closed the gate and smoothed the corners of the notice that said penalty and restricted. He placed the towel over the top rail for a moment and then carried it with him, folded neat, weight on his shoulder like a hand. He slept deep that night, asleep like a long, low lake. He dreamed he was smoothing a sheet that would not stop lifting at the corners. He woke just before dawn, with his hands pressed to the mattress, the same old posture. He lay there and listened for the thud under the world. It came, and this time it sounded not like a door closing, but like one opening, a hollow sound that did not mean welcome any more than it meant warning. He sat up. He did not turn on the light. He dressed in the dark by feel. He took the towel from the chair back. It was still damp at the edges and dry in the middle, a condition that encapsulated something he did not find words for. He walked through a town that had not quite decided to wake. The traffic light at the corner went to green and stayed too long, and then changed its mind as if embarrassed. The mill had not begun its cough. The air carried that thin, wet blade that announces a first frost before the sun touches it and turns it ordinary again. He reached the gate without feeling his feet much. He opened the latch without thought. He went to the oldest corner with the knowledge of a man who has walked a certain path enough times he could walk it with his eyes shut. The oval waited. He set the towel down. He set the tamper down. He knelt. He lay on his side. He pressed his cheek to the grass. The smell rose up into his face, clean and bitter and soft and damp. He put his palm on the ground in front of his heart. He did not close his eyes. He listened. The earth under the old stone moved, not like a beast and not like a machine. It shifted its weight, And in that shift, he felt both the pull and the give. He understood in a way that would elude any exact telling that the ground wanted to keep certain things and wanted certain things kept, and that both wants could be met by hands that knew how to press and when. He rolled onto his back and looked up into the oak canopy and saw the small, thin disk of mourning through a pocket of leaves. A bird crossed the gap and made no sound. He sat up and folded the towel and stood and pressed with his palms in those small circles that had become his signature. He worked until the sun found the stones and laid a thin strand of light along each edge. He stood then and let the light calculate him, and he felt it decide there was a shape to him and that the shape would be, for now, sufficient. Later at the shed, he wiped the tamper's head and set it in the corner near the door. He did not hang it back on the high hook where official tools go. He kept it close, as you keep a broom when the kitchen floor has started telling you stories. The clerk came by and set a stack of envelopes on the workbench and asked him if he had a second. He said yes. She said someone from the county would be coming again to talk about long-term plans. She said a phrase about mitigation and another about the optics of indefinite closure. She watched his face when she said optics. He told her he had a job to do and that he would do it. And she said she knew, and that was the end of the conversation, because neither of them had words that could reach past the edge of the fence and make sense of what lay under that older corner beyond the reach of their paperwork. He drove out beyond the mill to where the lane had sunk and where they had fed it fill and told it to behave. He stood with his boots planted and felt the ground answer in a new language that sounded like rest. He drove back by the bus stop, where the bench sat just so, and the base of the sign held its angle without leaning. He drove slow along the street where the manholes had wrapped and heard a new note, not hollow and not fully filled either. Something in between, like a throat that has decided for one day to talk less. He stopped by his apartment and climbed the stairs and set the towel on the chair back. He opened the refrigerator and listened to the hum climb and cough and then settle. And he knew if he pressed his palm against the side of the machine, the hum would answer his hand, and he did, and it did. And he shut the door gently and stood there in the light. Evening fell with a steadiness he appreciated. He took the tamper to the cemetery because that is what he did now. He pressed, he smoothed, he set his cheek to the grass for one slow breath, and then he stood and carried the towel back to the gate. He did not wait for the old woman, because he no longer knew whether she belonged to the living who walk with towels, and knives and wedges, or to the other kind of maintenance this town required. He waited only for the latch to give that sound of well-made metal, and when it did, the sound landed in his chest like a small weight finding its place. He walked home. He crossed at the long red. He passed the used furniture store where a cedar chest in the window had sat for weeks and now had the lid propped open by a book, and some part of him wanted to go in and close it because lids should meet their boxes. He did not. He went upstairs and sat in his chair and listened to the neighbor S-cat roll the marble once and then let it rest. He closed his eyes and saw the pressed oval the way a man sees a task done and undone and done again, and does not resent the repetition. He opened his eyes and went to the sink and ran the water and waited for the metallic taste to soften and then drank. That night the sound came from beneath. It came once, the hollow thud that could be read as a door closing if you needed to read it that way, and then it came again, softer, like a hand finding a familiar latch in the dark and not missing it this time. Cal lay on his back and listened and did not move. Somewhere between those sounds and the mourning there was a kind of agreement, not written, not spoken, signed in the small presses and smoothings he had made along paths and at edges. He did not know who the parties to the agreement were. He knew he would keep it because that is what he did. He slept then not as if dead, not as if alive in any dramatic way, but as a man wearing himself into a groove in a world that would hold him as long as he kept his hands moving, keeping what wanted kept allowing what wanted keeping to settle, smoothing the edges so the rest of the town could walk without catching a toe and cursing the air. In the morning, the towel had dried only a little, damp halfway down its length and dry at the fold. He shook it once, and the sound made a small note in the room that felt clean. He folded it and laid it on the back of the chair, the patterned knife tucked beneath, the twine a tidy coil beside it, the wedges stacked in a tower that would topple if anyone bumped the table, which no one would. He went to work. He drove the truck. He tamped. He listened. He answered the machine when it blinked. He smoothed the corners of notices. He closed the gate. He opened the gate. He met the weight wherever it asked and gave it place, and when the light found him, as it crossed from the mill to the river, it took his measure and found him proportional to the job, for now, and that was enough to carry him through the day and into the next, into and out of the sound under the world that marked nothing in particular and everything at once. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.